Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, listeners, to episode 168 of the Ad Nauseam podcast. My name is Dr. David C. Noe. Doctor is a name my parents gave to me at birth. Wow. I'm here in the vomitorium on a blustery December day. It's the 18th? No, 19th.
19th, yeah.
In the vomitorium, the bunker of the RHB bookstore and coffee shop, with my good friend and excellent co-host, Dr. Jeffrey T. Winkle. How are you doing this afternoon, Jeff?
I'm doing all right. It's always good to kind of come out of the bluster and the cold down into the bunker where it's warm and cozy.
Yes,
and much more conducive to intellectual conversation than kind of standing out in the parking lot.
Yes, yeah. In that great novel by H.G. Wells, which is the one I'm thinking of. You know, where they go down underground. It's about Mars or something. I'm not going to be able to remember. There was a Jeremy Irons movie. He was in it. And there's the Morlocks and the...
Oh, yeah. Is this the Time Machine?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
The Eloise or something and the Morlocks?
I remember the Morlocks.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Did the Morlocks live underground?
I've seen clips of that movie. I've seen that they were cave dwellers.
Kind of.
Yeah, kind of. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why did I bring this up?
Are you feeling like a Morlock here down in
Well,
the
I was
cave?
wondering about their thermal properties, right? Because underground, it's never cold, right? It's a steady temperature. So,
right.
So they're going to be doing okay, and that's a classic. That's an excellent book, by the way.
Absolutely.
Yes, very good.
How you doing, Dave?
I'm doing okay, honestly. Yeah, I got a lot on my mind these days.
So what's on your mind?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of running the buzzer for my daughter's homeschool basketball team.
Was this really a privilege?
Oh, that was incredible. For the game, I had one of these remotes, you know, that was supposed to run the scoreboard and the timer.
Yeah.
And I had to do a number of different things at once with only 10 fingers. I had to start and stop the time whenever the ref blew the whistle.
Yep.
And along the way, I learned that you don't pause the time when someone scores, you keep it running.
Okay.
And so this was the longest, it's 4 6-minute quarters, the longest 24 minutes of my life.
Oh, man.
It was a huge challenge.
Were you just thrown into this? Was there any kind of primer on how to work the gadgets?
A very brief primer.
Okay.
After 30 seconds of detailed instruction, the ref said, "Do you think you got it?" I said, "How am I supposed to do this with a grade school education? Are you kidding me?"
Oh, my God.
I had to use all of my digits at the same time. And then the irony was that my daughter was playing, so sometimes when her team was, doing well, I would just totally forget
that you were
I'm supposed to be keeping
duty?
time.
Yeah.
And I'd look up and the clock's not running, So I'd look around and say, who's running this clock? And then it dawned on me.
Yeah.
I'm running the clock.
So it wasn't like keeping time. You had to press you have to sound the buzzer at particular times too, right? Yeah.
Yes. 15 seconds before the timeout ends.
Yes.
That's for a 30-second timeout. 15 seconds before the 1-minute timeout ends. There are both, coaches timeouts and fast food timeouts. There's just all kinds of things going on.
Yeah.
Then you had to reset the time for the halftime, and it's one of those things where you have to page through the digits, it's just.
Oh my goodness. You weren't also the guy that's like checking players in and out.
No, but I had to buzz for checking them in and out.
Okay. Yeah.
It was a nightmare.
That sounds terrible.
Who would have thought that a PhD in classics did not prepare me for this?
Because you thought, oh, yeah, come on.
Sure.
What could be the problem with this?
No. And then I asked the ref, what happens if I run out of batteries halfway through? Because this is another fear I had.
Yeah.
He really had no answer.
No answer. Mm-hmm.
So I thought, take me back to the world of Greek verbs, irregular and defective.
Yes.
I can handle that.
That's your comfort zone.
Deiknoumi, I can conjugate that thing. But figure out how to set the tens place on the timer? No chance.
So I take it you're not going to be back there doing this again?
If needed, I will answer the call.
Gotcha. Right.
Yes.
Oh, man. I'm sorry to hear that.
That's okay.
Yeah.
What are we talking about today?
This is part 2 of 2 parts, where we are talking about secondary literature that has shaped your thought, my thought, in our journey to becoming classicists.
It's a good thing that you mentioned that it's second part of 2 parts.
Yes.
because the regular audience is wondering, when are they going to finish up Maru or Richard?
Right. We got those kind of hanging out there.
Yeah, and the answer is in our own good time.
Exactly. We'll finish them when we finish them.
Be patient.
Right, yeah, relax.
We're going into a new year, 2025.
Right.
There's lots more to talk about. And no need to worry.
Indeed, right.
Okay.
But our topic for today we got through a few of these books in the last episode. We're going to try to get through the rest of our list today. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, we're going to have The Justice of Zeus from Sir Hugh-Lloyd Jones. Mm-hmm. We're going to have, from Jeff's side, what are we talking about, Jeff?
We're talking about The Greeks and the Irrational by E.R. Dodds.
Eric Robert. And we're talking about Duane Litfin, St. Paul's Theology of Proclamation.
Yes, and then I will say a bit about Magic in the Roman World by one Naomi Janowitz.
Nice, and then I will cover Augustine of Hippo, a biography, the new edition by Peter Brown. And then if we have time or we need to round it out, Plato's Psychology by Robinson. That's another text of mine, T.M. Robinson.
Mm-hmm. And if time allows, I will say a bit about B.E. Perry's The Ancient Romances.
Nice,
Yep.
Nice. Before we get into it, we do not have a shout out, but we have a special promo, don't we, Jeff?
We do, yes.
We're giving something away.
We're giving away one of these new Ratio 4s.
Wow, that's incredible.
Very excited.
Now, has yours arrived yet in the mail?
It's not. I think I heard from you yesterday that it is en route. I'm very excited to get mine.
Yes, you've got the shipping and tracking number. You're going to get a Ratio 4 sleek black machine. And we're going to give one away. Ad Nauseam is going to give away a Ratio 4.
Yes.
And we have decided to make you, our loyal listener, jump through some hoops.
Yes.
In order to be signed up for this free Ratio 4.
So what do they need to do to get this?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you that.
Oh, I thought you knew. Well, they need to write to us,
yes.
right?
Send an email to dave@adnauseam.com. You can spell Dave. Don't forget that ad nauseam has a V in it. ADNAVSEAM.com. I just heard from a new listener today. We'll call him, let's call him Logan, because that's his name. And he said, I was looking for your podcast, and I went to ad nauseam spelled another way.
Oh, no.
And in the first 5 to 10 minutes, there was lots of expletives and other stuff. And I'm thinking, Logan, why did you listen to 10 minutes to find out? You really thought that was us?
Come on.
Yeah, no. So don't go to that one.
No.
Because this is a family show.
Right.
Ad nauseam, ADNAVSEAM. Send dave@adnauseam.com an email, and they need to include the secret code word, Jeff, which is
quatuor.
Yes, the Latin word quatuor, which means
4.
4. And here's how it's spelled. You might want to get a pencil. Quattuor. Now, I'm not going to say that if you spell it incorrectly, you are disqualified from the drawing.
Oh, really? We're going to hold them to that?
No.
Okay, all right.
We're not going to hold their feet to the Kindle brick.
All right.
But I am going to say that if you misspell it, we're going to be really displeased.
Right. And we may mention it on air, too.
Yes, and name the individual.
Yes.
Yeah, is that called doxing?
Doxing. Yes.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So send an email to dave@adnauseam.com. In the subject heading, put something like, I want the 4. And in the body of the text, spell the Latin word, which is quatuor. Quattuor. That's quirky, isn't it, Jeff?
Yep.
We're going full-on quirk here.
And do we have a deadline for this?
Yeah, you need to do it by March 1.
Okay.
We're going to let this run for a couple months to try to get a lot of people in the hopper.
Yep.
Because the last time we gave away a coffee machine, we gave away a Ratio 6.
Remember that.
It was completely and totally random. But it just so happened that a close friend of mine won the coffee machine.
Ah, man, yeah.
Someone who lives here in West Michigan. Totally random, for sure.
But made people suspicious.
Yeah, we were audited by Price Waterhouse and Cooper or something like that. But we want to get a lot of entries. So dave@adnauseam.com, and the code word is quatuor, Quattuor. We'll mention it later in the program, and you could be signed up for a Ratio 4.
Yes, don't hesitate. All right, Dave, let's get us back into this with your first book here, The Justice of Zeus.
Yeah, so this is by Sir Hugh-Lloyd Jones, published by the University of California Press in 1971.
So he was knighted.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, a classicist who was knighted.
Weren't you?
No.
No.
Not even close.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Dave, when did you read this book, and what kind of influence did it have on you?
Yeah, well, it was recommended to me. This is going to surprise you. You're sitting down by a former colleague.
Is that right?
Yes, whose initials were USD.
Oh, okay. Yes,
yeah,
I remember.
I'm sure you remember him well. He said, "Why don't you read this book?" And some of his recommendations were off the wall. This was a home run.
Okay,
and I believe I read it in 2011, 2012, right before I went on a sabbatical. And the reason I really liked it in brief is because I've read the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, taught on them in myth and other courses many, many times. And as a Christian, I've always had a number of unanswered questions of how to understand the Homeric epics in particular along theological lines. And so on the one hand, I think it would be a mistake to read Homer as a theologian in the strong sense. In other words, I don't think his intention in those books is primarily to teach us how to think about the gods.
Yeah. Okay.
So I would say that's an error of interpretation, that's not his primary intention. The opposite error, you might put it on the other end of the spectrum, is to think that Homer is not teaching us anything about the gods, or that was not a secondary intention. And this book was one of the best for me in terms of, drawing together some of the floating or disparate strands and threads of my thinking around these kinds of questions about what are the gods doing in the epics.
Now, does this book, does it directly address Homer?
Absolutely.
Specifically?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Specifically, in the proemium to the Iliad, we have this interesting phrase, the will of Zeus was fulfilled. I think it's hebule is the noun there. The rest of it I would probably stumble over if I were to quote the Greek. And thus the will of Zeus was fulfilled. So it's very clear in Homer's mind that the playing out of the entire epic has something to do with Zeus's foreordaining and divine will. On the surface, this has a lot to do with, or a lot of similarity to, Christian notions, specifically in an Augustinian context, Christian notions of God's foreordaining providence.
Yeah.
Which is an idea that has always fascinated me from the first time I discovered it.
Sure.
And I think it fascinates most people if they ever think about it, whether they are drawn to it or repulsed by it. It has that effect, you know?
Yes.
And so Lloyd Jones deals with this at length. And I'd like to begin with a quote here from pages 32 and 33.
Please.
The main theological difference between the epics Iliad and Odyssey lies in the Odyssey's rejection of the belief that a god may suggest wicked or foolish, as well as good or wise actions to the minds of men. But since in the Iliad the human agent must always be held fully responsible for his action, even though a god has caused him to perform it, the Odyssean modification of the doctrine exemplified in the Iliad is of strictly limited significance. It is just the modification of the Iliad's theology that we might expect to find in a poem whose aims and methods differ from those of the Iliad in the way in which those of the Odyssey differ. If in both epics the terms generally translated good refer primarily to skill or excellence, that does not mean that justice or righteousness has not considerable importance. Even in a Christian community in which the primacy of the so-called cooperative virtues is officially acknowledged, those who are clever, strong, or powerful tend to receive more commendation, except from the devout, than those whose excellence is purely moral.
That's a whole lot there.
That's profound, isn't it?
It is very profound. Could you unpack that a little bit?
I can unpack some of it,
please,
sure.
Yeah.
So Lloyd Jones is making a number of claims. First of all, that the purposes of the Iliad and Odyssey are different. And in the Odyssey, there is a rejection of the belief that a god may suggest wicked and foolish, as well as good or wise actions to the minds of men. Whereas in the Iliad, the gods suggest both kinds of things.
Yes.
Right. To the minds of one of the characters, Paris, for example, Menelaus, Hector, Achilles, the gods can be saying, engage in this wicked action.
Yes.
Engage in this foolish action. In the Odyssey, however, the world has become much more domesticated and moral, you might say. But, says Lloyd Jones, even this suggestion is of limited significance. So the Iliad and the Odyssey differ in that respect theologically about what the gods do, but we have to carefully circumscribe the significance of that because we need to remember, he says, that in a Christian community, there is a primacy placed on cooperative virtues, and we officially acknowledge that, right? So a cooperative virtue is something like patience, right? If you're bigger and stronger and smarter, that doesn't mean you get to run roughshod over those who are smaller and more foolish and weaker.
Yes.
That's a uniquely Christian or a strongly Christian cooperative virtue. But, says Lloyd Jones, even though that's officially acknowledged, if you are clever, strong, or powerful, you tend to receive more praise, more commendation, even in a Christian context.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think everybody knows that.
Yes.
Right? And that's one of the things that can upset people quite a bit. Right? So we're in this setting where the cooperative virtues are supposed to be privileged, and yet the handsomest or the wealthiest or the most eloquent is getting all of the attention.
Yeah.
And Lloyd Jones is saying that's just kind of human nature.
Yeah.
And it's only the most devout who can kind of cling to the notion that in the end, it is only purely moral virtues which deserve the title excellent. And so there's a depth of reflection here on these kinds of ideas that I found really compelling about Lloyd Jones.
That's interesting. It addresses, incidentally, kind of the question of authorship. Is that people who have theorized that the Iliad and the Odyssey were not composed by the same person have often pointed to kind of the radically different portrayals of the gods.
Right.
And here, Lloyd Jones is saying, well, yes, but
there's a limitation.
There's a limitation to that.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. And it's when in the Odyssey, when Athena wants Odysseus to be heard, recognized, and taken seriously, she makes him more attractive than he really is.
Yeah.
Right? So she
wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah. But I mean, that's something I talk about in my myth classes, about how in the Odyssey, though, the gods they seem to recede. Right? There's that one of the first episodes you have Zeus up on Olympus, and he's complaining about mortals because they don't listen to us. We tried to warn Aegisthus, and he didn't listen to us, and he kind of washes his hands of this. And Athena says, "Well, that's all well and good, Dad, but don't forget that you've promised that Odysseus would get home." And the gods, they lurk in the background of the Odyssey in a way that the gods of the Iliad are not in the background. They're in the forefront there. And there is that, like Jones was saying, there is a different kind of moral schematic in the Odyssey where you have the question of xenia, how you treat the stranger, how you act as a guest.
Right.
Which Zeus sits behind that.
Right.
But he's not maneuvering characters around like chess pieces like you see in the Iliad.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well put. Another really important lesson that I learned from this book that I think our readers can appreciate, especially if they read this literature or they teach it, is that we have said many times on this podcast, on this program, that Plato represents a watershed. Right? Homeric ideas of the gods continue up until the time of Plato, and then something dramatic and strange happens.
Yeah.
And this book, is a brilliant examination and illustration of that idea. So he says, for example, on page 88, both Heraclitus and Aeschylus, so the pre-Socratic philosopher, Aeschylus, the tragedian, held a belief which Homer and Hesiod had held before them. The purposes of Zeus are inscrutable to mortals. Only in the light of experience can men think over the past and trace out the working of the law of justice. So in other words, up until and including even the tragedians, the Homeric view of the gods and religion was just as it was represented to us by our dear former professor, Dr. Richard Weavers.
Yeah.
Zeus is just a big brute that refuses to die. In other words, what separates him from others is not his morality, because he doesn't evidence better morality. He just enforces on others better morality, and it is his immortality which makes him deserving of worship. Right. Which is so contrary to how, in a post-Platonic Christian world, people think about religion. Yeah. Yeah, that's wonderful. I think that if you look at if you compare the big three tragedians, Aeschylus to Sophocles to Euripides, right? All of them, I think they're wrestling with this issue. Like in the Oresteia, I see Aeschylus. He's trying to he's trying to equate. Maybe not equate's the right word, but he's trying to understand the justice of Zeus in terms of what this democratic experiment in Athens that's going on at the time. He wants them to kind of work hand in hand together. Sophocles, post-plague, right? The gods, it's much more existential.
and the gods, they pronounce through oracles, and oracles come true. There's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
And then if you compare that to a play like the Bacchae, there you have this god who's tremendously petty and out for personal revenge in a very direct and visceral kind of way.
Yeah. Are you reading my notes, Jeff?
No.
'Cause that's exactly where we're going
okay,
next.
Okay.
You anticipated it all brilliantly.
Well, pick it up there then.
Yeah, so he says on 128, since it, meaning Sophoclean justice, is far removed from Christian or other modern notions of justice, Sophoclean justice is even harder for us to understand than it was for Sophocles' contemporaries. Dike, that's the Greek noun, means not only justice, but the order of the universe. And from the human point of view, that order often seems to impose a natural rather than a moral law. Yet Sophocles believed that the gods were just, and just in a sense in which the word was in his day applied to men. What made it hard, he thought, for men to understand the justice of the gods was the immense extent of time which may separate cause from punishment, and the complex interweaving within human history of different causal chains of injustice followed by chastisement.
Yeah. I know that one of the things I've always wrestled with is that notion that the oracles can pronounce to Oedipus that you're going to marry your mother and kill your father,
right?
But at the same time,
right?
And of course, he has no choice.
Right.
It must happen. He's also morally culpable.
Exactly.
For those things, right.
That's the point I made to my students over and over again. Show me one place in this poem where Oedipus does something wrong. In other words, a choice that you would not have made. Show me one instance. And they try things like, well, shouldn't he have tried to avoid killing his father and marrying his... He did.
Yeah.
He fled as soon as at every juncture, he made what was ostensibly the correct moral choice. And yet at every juncture, he is doing the most deadly and damning things.
Right.
So where is his fault?
Right. That's often where I find with my students, they'll turn the conversation towards his temper.
Right.
Right. And that whole... I think a very flawed notion that look for the tragic flaw in every as kind of your linchpin.
The misunderstanding of Aristotle for sure,
without a doubt, right? But that's it's clear that a lot of students that they're coming from that. Well, what is the flaw between Oedipus? Well, he's got this raging temper, and he's flying off the handle. But I mean, all of the choices that have led to that have already been made.
Yes, the killing of his father is arguably self-defense.
Yeah,
and as a person of high standing, he was not allowed to bear the kind of insult where his father struck him with the staff.
Sure.
As they passed by.
Right.
So as Aristotle said, Oedipus Rex is the best play by the best tragedian.
Yeah.
And I think that stands.
Yeah.
But then we can look at Aristophanes, because Hugh-Lloyd Jones says on 133, you'll like this, I think, the occasional fun poked at the gods in comedy is no evidence against the religious conservatism of the ordinary man. It is when a religion is sure of itself that such amusement is permitted.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes, yeah. That's fascinating. I love that.
Growing up in West Michigan, right, Jeff, in a, dare I say it, a DS?
A DS?
Dutch subculture?
Yeah, oh, yes. Okay, yes.
Yeah. What were you allowed or permitted to make fun of religion? What was the...
It as I got older in my own household, it loosened.
Okay.
But I mean, definitely growing up when I was, a young kid and maybe an early teen, there was definitely kind of the sense, well, there are things that you don't say, there are things you do not question.
Tread lightly.
Mm-hmm. Right. But it kind of it loosened up as I got older, and my parents and I indeed, found humor in things that I like Lloyd Jones say doesn't mean. Not blasphemy, right, and doesn't mean that you're kind of rejecting the underpinnings of the belief, right? Yeah.
And then we turn to the tragedians, the other ones, if we could.
Please.
We'll wrap this up because this is really fascinating stuff. And again, it's a book out of print, but you can find
really?
it. Yes,
that's
there may be a paperback reprint.
Yeah.
But if you like this book, and I highly recommend it to all of our listeners, you might want to track it down. Really shaped my thinking as a secondary source. A modern audience will feel that though the gods in the Hippolytus, Andromache, and Bacchae, Euripidean, may have just complaints against Hippolytus, Neoptolemus, and Pentheus, they go too far in their revenge. That is a natural human reaction, which is voiced by the old man of the Hippolytus, when he says that the gods ought to be wiser than mortals, and by Cadmus in the Bacchae, when he calls the revenge of Dionysius just but excessive. But from the standpoint of ancient decay, or justice, each god is perfectly within his rights. For a mortal to refuse a god his due honor is dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, what do you make of that, and how does it fit with how you've taught these Euripidean plays?
That's right. Gets right to the heart of. I'll often kind of have a specific debate in myth class where I have one half of the class say, read the Bacchae, and you are defending that this is a play that respects the gods. That ultimately, what Euripides is saying is that despite what Dionysus does, the gods demand respect, and you give it. And the other side is Euripides is kind of like the atheist, right? And he's presenting gods that are so horrifying that he's saying at the end of the day, it's better to reject them. And side A, I think that's where Lloyd Jones is. I think it's a much more on the ground Greek view of things. That's the one that I get to. It's like, but from a modern point of view, it's horrifying what Dionysus does to Pentheus and such. But in terms of Greek understanding of justice and the nature of the gods, this is what the gods demand.
It's accurate.
Yeah.
I've got two quick quotes, and then we'll finish this off.
Okay.
Page 163. Plato may have wished to discipline the common man by reestablishing the official cults, but Plato's real theological beliefs had little in common with the ancient religion, as his criticisms of the poets help to show. So I think that demonstrates, very clearly, kind of the drum I have been beating for the last 168 episodes, is that when you say the Greek view of something, specifically theology, you have to distinguish pre and post Plato quite carefully.
Yes.
And I think it's fair to say, not that Plato is a monotheist, although he's pretty close, but maybe what Max Muller described as henotheism, right? There's one God, either Zeus or Apollo, depending on when you ask Plato, to whom all of the other gods are subordinate.
Yes.
But a full-on kind of polytheism is strongly criticized in the Apology, among other places, the Euthyphro as well.
Yeah, yes. Excellent.
And the last quote,
and
I'd like to get your response, page 164. The early Greeks were capable of their unique achievements, so that would be literature, architecture, and so forth, largely because they could bear, as their religion shows, very much more reality than most human beings. What do you think?
What does he mean by that? They could bear much more reality. I'm not quite following.
I think what he means is to bear reality is to honestly recognize the tremendous inconsistencies and troubles and pains in human life, and at the same time recognize and acknowledge the tremendous joys and accomplishments and achievements and value. So there's no kind of utopian view, right? Or a desire to create a utopia. There is a Hellenistic pessimism or a tragic vision.
Yes.
But that tragic vision at the same time doesn't exclude all of the good things.
Yes.
So in other words, they're thoroughgoingly honest about the human condition.
Right.
So the gods suggest wicked things. Whose fault is it if someone does something wicked, like accidentally eat their children, in the case of Atreus and Thyestes? Is it the god who suggested it? No. It's the individual who did it.
Right.
But what if the god's will is irresistible? Well, who's responsible for eating their own children? The person who did it.
Yeah.
So I think this is what Lloyd Jones means by the Greeks being able to bear much more reality than most human beings could.
Right. Yeah, that always, that's great. This always brings me back around to Aristophanes. So I think you can often, comedy in a culture as a barometer of the openness of a culture, I think is
to different ideas.
Right? And there's, while there is, nothing like Greek tragedy or Platonic philosophy going on in surrounding cultures at the same time, there's also nothing like Athenian old comedy,
right?
And the openness of not just of bringing a satirical, critical lens to the gods, but to politicians and the culture. So that, like Jones was saying, that's reflective of not of kind of a blasphemy, but a deep confidence in one's culture.
Right.
And it's extraordinary.
Right. So I know you're a large fan of Jim Gaffigan.
I am.
Lately I've been listening to the guy with the unpronounceable name from Tennessee.
Nate Bargatze.
Something like that. Neither of them are really political at all.
Right.
I mean, Gaffigan a little bit here and there, but recently, but they made their careers by being apolitical. I know there are some political comedians, some of whom you like, and that's fine. But they have never become, I would say, as successful as the apolitical ones.
Right.
So there is a key distinction between, say, our culture and Athenian old comedy.
Yeah.
Because it was impossible to imagine comedy without politics.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. This is one of those areas where I wish we had a lot more information on kind of how those plays went down.
Yeah.
Right. Audience response.
Right.
Because Aristophanes' plays are so overtly political. I mean, was ancient Athens of the late 5th century polarized in a way that is broadly reflective of kind of where American culture is right now?
Right.
How would that have? I know that Aristophanes did get in trouble for skewering particular politicians.
Yes.
Right? He wasn't immune from
Cleon, is that
Cleon, exactly, right. So, I mean, they came after him. So
Right.
it wasn't like this, again, kind of a utopian where, the freedom of comedy was absolute. But it does make me wonder about, how did this play? It's easy to, at a distance of 2,500 years, to say, oh, how wonderful,
Right.
and how confident and open that culture was. But how did that play out on the ground? And we bring up Gaffigan and Bargatze is that, today when comedians go political,
Right.
it's always very like, oh, they are a politician of the left, right?
Right.
Or, a comedian of the left,
Right.
They're immediately kind of pigeonholed and put into a particular
Or occasionally
box.
of the right.
Or occasionally of the right.
Right. Is that My Pillow guy? Is he a comedian?
I don't think he's a pillow guy. he's on the right, Isn't he?
I don't know, but
he sells pillows.
I guess, but recently I've been getting some ads for him, and I'm thinking, how does the YouTube algorithm know that I need a new pillow? It's incredible.
It's incredible, right? Yeah. Well, that's a whole other level.
All right.
of creepy mysticism, right?
So we need to go on to a Jeff pick.
Yeah.
And Jeff, what would you like to recommend to our listeners as a secondary source?
Yes, I would like to recommend a book from published in 1951 called The Greeks and the Irrational by one Eric Robert Dodds. And this was a very influential book on me. It was recommended by my dissertation advisor back in the day when I was kind of crafting my dissertation, looking at religious issues, notions of kind of dreams, mysticism, mystery cults in Apuleius's Metamorphoses. And he says, have you read The Greeks and the Irrational? I said, no, I haven't. He says, well, that's got to be your first stop. And so this was a book that, actually, I'll just let the opening paragraph kind of explain this. This is from chapter 1, which Dodds entitles Agamemnon's Apology. And he begins his book this way. He says, some years ago, I was in the British Museum looking at the Parthenon sculptures when a young man came up to me and said with a worried air, he said, I know it's an awful thing to confess, but this Greek stuff doesn't move me one bit. I said that was very interesting. Could he define at all the reasons for his lack of response? He reflected for a minute or two, and then he said, well, it's also terribly rational, if you know what I mean. I thought I did know. The young man was only saying what had been said more articulately by Roger Fry and others, to a generation whose sensibilities had been trained on African and Aztec art and on the work of such men as Modigliani and Henry Moore. The art of the Greeks and Greek culture in general is apt to appear lacking in the awareness of mystery and in the ability to penetrate to the deeper, less conscious levels of the human experience. So Dodds goes on in this book to kind of look at the other side of the coin. Right? And so he's responding mid-20th century to what it seemed to be kind of a fossilized view of the Greeks as important, but almost dried to the bone rational.
Right.
You think about the expressionless face of the Apollo Belvedere, right? As approaching everything with kind of an equanimity of a lack of emotion.
Or the Apollo at Olympus, right?
Yeah.
The battle of the Lapiths and Centaurs.
Right. While this chaos swirls around him.
Dispassionate face.
Exactly.
He's holding at arm's length one of the centaurs as he dispatches him, but he's not moved at all.
Yes. And so Dodds saw kind of an opportunity, to say, well, this the young kid who
he said I could drive a truck through that thesis.
Right. And so, but I love that opening. I hope it's a true anecdote where this young man said, this stuff just kind of leaves me cold.
If you don't have a true anecdote with a student to open your book, you got to invent one.
Oh, exactly.
Because we saw that last week with Lefkowitz, right?
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
About Socrates being black.
Right.
Yeah.
And Dodds is also a fantastic scholar of Greek in general, right? His critical text and commentary on the Gorgias, for example, of Plato is out of this world.
Yeah.
But what are some of the other things that you appreciated about the Greeks and the Irrational, specifically the time in which you read it and how it shaped you both as a thinker and maybe as a teacher?
Sure. So in Apuleius' Metamorphoses, there's a number of scenes where the gods or divine powers that be will send visions and give dreams. And these are taken very seriously by the people in the book, and it steers the plot in a particular direction. And one of the things that that I thought Dodds did very well is that he took those scenes very seriously. And he looked at, dream narratives in Homer, dream narratives kind of throughout Greek and Roman literature. And rather than just dismiss them as kind of a plot device, as when he wrote this book, that was kind of, we don't take these things seriously. This isn't reflective of any kind of real,
it's like something on Gilligan's Island.
Exactly, right.
Where you have the wavy...
Exactly.
Exactly.
right.
And suddenly it's a dream.
Right. And he started to ponder is that, so he's also writing in 1951. There's a lot of kind of pop Freudian, pop Jungian stuff kind of entering into the mainstream. And he's saying, our current understanding of dreams is they don't tell you the future. They don't tell you, what to do next. They tell you about your past. And so we tend to look at dreams as kind of the archaeology of the self.
Right. Freudian terms.
But in ancient dream narratives, it's always the gods, something telling you what's coming up or what you need to do next. And so he was grappling with that. And he says that the wrong thing to do is simply dismiss this as, just kind of a plot device of these naive, superstitious Greeks, and so he has a whole chapter on, it's called Dream Pattern and Culture Pattern, where he talks about the role and the place of dreams and how the Greeks took this stuff very, very seriously, and that is at odds with a kind of that stereotype of kind of the cold rational approach. Let me read a little bit.
Okay. Then I have a question for you, if I may.
This is in the section where he's talking about dreams as they appear in Homeric epics. He says, in most of their descriptions of dreams, the Homeric poet treats what is seen as if it were objective fact. The dream usually takes the form of a visit paid to a sleeping man or a woman by a single dream figure. The dream figure could be a god or a ghost or a pre-existing dream messenger, or simply an image in eidolon. And then just jumping ahead, he says, the dreamer, meanwhile, is almost completely passive. He sees a figure, he hears a voice, and that is practically all. Sometimes it is true he will answer in his sleep, once he stretches out his arms to embrace the dream figure. But these are objective physical acts, such as men are observed to perform in their sleep. The dreamer does not suppose himself to be anywhere else than in his bed. And in fact, he knows himself to be asleep, since the dream figure is at pains to point this out to him. You are asleep, son of Atreus, says the wicked dream in Iliad 2. You are asleep, Achilles, says the ghost of Patroclus. You are asleep, Penelope, says the shadowy image in the Odyssey. All this bears little resemblance to our own dream experience, and scholars have been inclined to dismiss it, like so much else in Homer, as poetic convention or epic machinery. It is, at any rate, highly stylized, as the recurrent formulae show. I shall come back to this point presently. Meanwhile, we may notice that the language used by Greeks at all periods in describing dreams of all sorts appears to be suggested by a type of dream in which the dreamer is the passive recipient of an objective vision. And so he goes on to kind of unpack he goes through the language, the different words that the Greeks use for dreams, and he develops a kind of theory of dream experience for the ancients. It's fascinating.
So poetic epic convention or poetic machinery is the way the critics deal with those things?
Yes.
Interesting.
And so that it's just a
highly dismissive.
Very dismissive. A very kind of lazy way of just saying, okay, well, this is it's a plot device. And nothing more. Right. So
how has it shaped your teaching?
Well, I think when I first read this, and understood that Dodds in his scholarship, he's pushing back against what had become kind of a solidified stereotype about the Greeks, and I'm often drawn to scholarship that does that.
It's contrarian in some way.
Contrarian, right? So even the like something like Black Athena,
right, whose
ultimate thesis I've come to reject. It's that kind of scholarship that will kind of say, hey, wait a minute, raise questions and kind of knock on windows and kind of kick open doors that I think that at their best they raise questions that need to be addressed, and in particularly in a field like classics where to the present day it continues to kind of wrestle with its place in the larger world of academia.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's authors like Dodds that I really respect, and that they have kind of the genius to raise these banners and ask these questions that need to be asked, and kind of necessarily kind of push push our understanding of the classes in the ancient world forward.
Thank you. And then my final question is, does Dodds deal with the Apollonian versus Dionysiac impulse? Is that a part of the book?
It is, right. So it's not a huge part of it, but he definitely, that notion of, that kind of this idea that classics by mid 20th century had become much too Apollonian. Right. And so I'm going to explore the Dionysian. So, I mean, he spends a lot of time talking about the Bacchae.
Right.
And talking about the figure of Dionysus as representative of kind of the purely irrational, right? And so he addresses that question of our instinct is Classicus who kind of sees the Greeks as their main identity is inherently rational, right? That's their main gift that they've given to the world. It's very easy to see Dionysus as a villain.
Okay,
right? He's there to kind of tear it all down. And Dodds says, no, this is just this is the other side to the coin, right? And he also connects it to kind of Plato's theory of the soul, right? The dark half and the light half. And the idea is there philosophically or personally is not to kind of get rid of the dark half altogether. It's to find almost a kind of like Eastern balance between the two, right? So you Apollo, yes, but tempered with Dionysus. Right.
Well, speaking of tempering with Dionysus,
yes,
it's time for the ads.
All right.
This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by the great folks of Racial Coffee. Just a couple weeks ago, Jeff, I think it was a week ago Friday, I was talking to the entrepreneur himself.
Were you really?
Mark Helweg, yes, on the phone. I was asking him about the 4. He was asking me and my evaluation of the product. We swapped stories, talked a little bit about what's ahead in the future for Ratio. It was a very wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
And this man, he has brought excellent coffee to the masses, none of this mass-produced stuff, but automated pour over, whether in the ratio 8, the 6, or now the 4.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about coffee and the irrational? How did you move from the 6 to the 8?
Well, it was a very rational move for me to move to the 6 to the 8, but the way that the 8 performs, the magic of the bloom stage, the water coursing through the Fibonacci head, it's all very mysterious. It strikes me as very Dionysian in a way. So I would say that my ratio 8 is the perfect combination, the perfect balance between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Yes.
Should we recycle some of the old jokes, like the Harold Bloom stage, closing of the American coffee pot?
Right. Did we already do that one?
I think we did, but I like it. I think it's good. And there's a chance that someone didn't listen to the previous ad.
It's true.
So we got to trot it out again.
That's right.
So your morning routine, as I recall, right, as I can discern using binoculars and a notepad,
yes,
is you go down to the kitchen. You have your beans ground the night before.
I do.
Because you're not a purist.
I'm not a purist.
Okay.
Right.
And then you put it in the little cone. Are you using paper filter?
No, I've got the metal cone.
Nice.
The life changer.
Then you push a number of buttons like operating a basketball timer?
No, it's actually quite the opposite. There's one button.
Just one button.
One touch and you're off and running.
Okay.
And you got the bloom stage.
Right.
You got the brew stage, and then the last stage is it's done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things I talked to Mark about was how simple the ratio is, because I've owned a number of different coffee machines like the Dack and Blecker.
Yeah.
And, they're always adding bells and whistles.
Yeah.
In the terms of now you can use Bluetooth to remotely turn on your coffee while you're pulling into your driveway or even headed in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And those are so low cost now that they have some initial appeal. Wouldn't it be fun for my coffee machine to be able to do all of these things?
Yeah.
Now, maybe it's just because I'm getting older,
right?
But I am less enamored of such things.
Me too.
I really, really like the ritual and the just push the button, the one button, and just wait for the great cup of coffee.
Yes, I link it to my desire to kind of get back into vinyl.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
It's just the simplicity.
So you're saying ratio is the vinyl of coffee making?
Well, I mean, it's
but
like
simpler.
It's simpler, right?
Yeah.
But it's classic vinyl.
Right.
It never goes out of style.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I should talk about the 4 probably.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, what's your experience with the 4?
It's been great.
Yeah.
It's been absolutely great. It has a kind of a smoke-colored glass carafe. As the name implies, it's smaller than the 8 and 6. It's got the same fantastic brewing technology.
Nice.
It's not made out of metal or out of wood. It is made out of a really hard polymer kind of plastic. It's a beautiful machine, has the same aesthetics, a much smaller footprint on the countertop, more real estate, you might say.
Yeah.
Takes up less real estate. And it has a detachable water tank. So I can take this water tank off and take it over to my refrigerator, fill it up easily with, filtered water, go back, pop it into place, one touch button, and the thing takes off immediately.
Oh, that's fantastic.
It just, it's incredible.
Yeah, I can't wait to get mine.
Yeah.
It's going to go right into my office.
That's right.
That detachable water tank, just take it down the hall.
Exactly.
To the sink, and it'd be perfect.
If the 8 or the 6 have any weaknesses, which of course they don't, are we required by law to say that?
Maybe.
It would be that sometimes it's a little difficult to get them filled with the water, right?
Yep.
But not the 4. It's perfect.
Excellent.
So let's say you're listener, and you want to get a free ratio 4. What should they do?
They should write to Dave at adnauseam.com. Don't forget that V. And write into the body of your email the Latin word for the number 4, which is quatuor.
Are we going to tell them how to spell it?
That's Quattuor.
And that will enter them for a drawing that will take place after March 1st.
Yes.
And then you could win a free ratio 4. But if they can't do that, or they don't want to do that, if they want to get one now, what should they do, Jeff?
Yeah, if they want to get a 4 now or get the 6 or the 8, go to ratiocoffee.com. Check out their machines. Put the one that you want in the grocery basket. And Dave, what's our coupon code for the month of December?
The month of December's coupon code is ANCO and then 5P.
5P. And do we decide what the P stands for?
I think the P stands for...
Platypus?
Platypus.
Because why not?
Exactly. ANCO 5P. And what will they get?
They will get 15% off your entire order.
Excellent.
This episode of Ad Nauseam is also brought to you by the wonderful folks at Hackett Publishing, our favorite publisher out there.
Absolutely,
I gotta say,
hands down.
And
it's not just because they sponsored the podcast, although that has something to do with it.
It has a little bit to do with it.
Why else?
Well, because this company, they've been around for 54 years now, with their offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Indianapolis, Indiana. They've been keeping the torch burning for the classics all this time, through all of kind of the crazy ups and downs of academia,
right,
and fads coming and going.
That's right.
They have kind of held solid ground, and they do a number of wonderful things. But my two favorite things is they offer all manner of different works from different corners of the academic world, lots of classics out there, and they do it in an attractive and affordable fashion, and the quality of the scholarship and the quality of the translations are just simply top-notch.
Absolutely. Yeah, they have multiple offerings, translations of Plato's Republic. We've been talking about Plato a lot, or I have at least, and if you're interested in reading the man, you can get the CDC Reeve translation. You can get many other translations of Plato's Republic and other works by Plato.
Yeah.
You can get Descartes if you're interested in early modern philosophy. They have East Asian studies, South American studies. They have contemporary philosophy. They have French literature and art. Pretty much anything you can imagine, they will have a title in that particular nook.
Indeed, yeah.
And this is not low quality material.
No, and it's crazy. I'm in the stage where I'm starting to look at colleges as my boys get older. Where they might check out going and looking at tuition costs, and on every page it says you've got to factor in the cost for textbooks,
right? And
it's outrageous.
Which you're going to have to get a HELOC on, right?
Yeah, seriously.
Home equity line of credit,
right? Just to afford the books.
That's right.
Right. You will not have that problem at Hackett. So if you're interested in building your own library with high quality, attractive, affordable books, Hackett Publishing should be your first and probably last stop.
That's right. Yep. So, listener, you want to get yourself some good titles at great prices. Build your library so that you can enjoy a great cup of coffee. Here in our part of the world, it's chilly. Nothing is perhaps to me more satisfying than sitting inside watching the snow fall with a good book and a hot cup of coffee.
Absolutely.
Go to hackettpublishing.com, HACKETT publishing.com. Peruse their large catalog, drop some titles into your shopping cart, and then enter this coupon code at checkout.
AN2024.
And what will that get them, Jeff?
That will get them two incredible things: 20% off your entire order and free shipping.
Check it out.
All right, Dave, as we get back into it, I believe it is your turn to offer up a tome.
That's correct.
Yeah, what do you got?
This is one by Duane Litfin, and it is called St. Paul's Theology of Proclamation. So this was published by the University of Cambridge Press in 1994, and it was recommended to me by a friend who is also a preacher. His name is Christopher, and he said, you really ought to read this book because it will, I think, strongly change or maybe help your view of what it means to be a Christian preacher.
Really? So, and just from the title here,
Yes.
it says St. Paul's Theology of Proclamation, 1 Corinthians 1-4, and Greco-Roman Rhetoric.
That's right.
It strikes you, okay, this is going to be a text about taking the Pauline epistles and putting them in context.
Exactly.
Okay, and understanding them from a first century point of view.
Right.
Okay.
And this particular book, I'll just try to be as candid as I can.
Yeah.
Scratched a particular itch of mine.
Which is?
Well, I have to give a little bit of an autobiography here, and that is when I was in graduate school, starting in 1995. In 1997, I began doing some preaching at the local church. I was 20. How old was I in 1997? 24. And let me say I had no business doing what I was doing. I would not allow someone like myself now to do that if I had a vote.
Yeah.
But anyway, I began doing it.
Okay.
So how did I begin doing it at that time? Well, I had studied classical rhetoric, right? I was in graduate school for classics. I knew my book by Kennedy. I knew some Lysias, some Cicero, Demosthenes, and I thought, well, I should write a sermon, deliver a sermon like a classical orator. I don't mean with that level of skill. I just mean trying to follow the structure.
Yeah.
So we did an episode loading the canons on classical rhetoric.
Yeah.
And that's how I wrote my sermons.
Oh, wow.
Right? So here's the exordium, the introduction. Here is the narratio, the telling of the story. Here's where I prove my point, the confirmatio. Here's where... And I did it like that. And I don't think it was necessarily very successful. I also don't especially regret adopting that method because it was really helpful to me in the beginning stages.
Yeah.
And I think it would be really helpful to many preachers today if they had something as structured as a classical speech.
Yeah.
But over time, as I matured, hopefully, as a thinker and as a person, I became less and less enamored of that kind of preaching. And as I listened to a lot more preaching, both my own and others, I became a lot more suspicious of any kind of rhetoric in preaching. Now, I mean, someone might say that's a really naive thing to think because nobody can preach without engaging in rhetoric. Obviously, you can't stand in front of other people and talk without there being some rhetoric. But it was the kind of rhetoric that I began to become very disenchanted with. And I guess this would be the standard sermon of introduction with a hook, 3-point sermon, then a concluding poem or a peroration, right? A peroratio, which is the concluding part where you really try to get people to do something.
Yeah.
And so these ideas had been bouncing around in my head for almost 30 years when my friend recommended this book to me. I read it just about 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And it confirmed a lot of the things that I had been thinking. Specifically, that what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians about how his preaching is different than the wisdom of the world. He is drawing a sharp distinction between classical or pagan rhetoric and what a Christian preacher ought to do. And for me, this was very freeing because I had, as I said, I had come to dislike the strong rhetorical element that was in so much preaching, but I couldn't give it a good historical I couldn't give my dislike a good historical or theological foundation. But what I had learned was that this is not what Paul was doing. He was not trying to give a Christian version of Lysias or a Christian version of Cicero or Demosthenes when he's preaching. And one of the interpretations that is popular of that passage is that Paul is arguing in that letter to the Corinthians against only one kind of pagan rhetoric, and that on another occasion he might use a more exalted kind of pagan rhetoric. What we see, for example, in Acts 17, right? In Acts 17, he is in Athens on Mars Hill.
Yes. Okay.
He's talking to the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers.
Right.
But Litfin's deeper point is that this is a theological choice on the part of Paul to distinguish between what he's doing and what the ancient orators were doing, and that Paul is presenting that as what he intends to be a perpetual model of Christian teaching. And to me, that is a groundbreaking idea, or it's a fundamentally significant idea. So sometimes I've explained this to people in this way. In the ancient world, orators stood up to deliver a speech. It was definitely a performance.
Yeah.
So Plutarch says about Cicero that when he spoke, the crowd swayed back and forth at the rhythms of his speech, and that when Cicero spoke, lightning flashed from his fingers. It was definitely a performance.
Yes.
In the early Christian church, there's excellent evidence that ministers sat down while they were preaching, and the congregation stood. In fact, the minister sat in a chair called a cathedra, and the congregation stood quite close to him. Now, this was for two reasons. One is that the person of greater authority sits, and those of lesser authority stand.
Yeah.
Like if you visited the King of England, what's his name? It's Charles?
Chucky.
Chuck, right.
Yep.
I guarantee he'd be the one sitting, Winkle,
Right.
and you would be standing or maybe crawling or something. Right?
Indeed.
There's a disparity of power. So in the early church, they wanted to emphasize the authority of the word, not the person. So the person delivering the word sat, the congregation stood. So that was one reason. The second reason is that it was a deliberate counterpart to the way that pagan rhetoric was conducted. It was trying to remove all performative aspects from it.
Interesting.
Now, I'm not saying that this is a model for, Christian preaching today. I don't think it's all that important that the preacher stands, the congregation sits. That's fine.
Yeah.
But the idea behind it, which is that this is not like other kinds of communication, that's what this book proves so eloquently and accurately, that it made the book extremely informative to me.
Yeah.
As both a thinker and a preacher.
So he's arguing that Paul is, he's not just laying out the gospel. He is very directly trying to distinguish his approach, his layout, his argument from the way that the philosophers were doing.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I want to read from page 247, the section Summary and Conclusions, and that makes sense, right? The Apostle Paul's view of the role of a preacher contrasted sharply with that of the Greco-Roman orator. To be sure, Paul also viewed the audience as a given, but unlike the rhetor, Paul disavowed the task of inducing belief in his listeners. Now think about that with me for a moment, if you would, Jeff. Unlike the pagan orator or rhetor, Paul disavowed the task of inducing belief in his listeners. So what was Cicero or Demosthenes trying to do? Trying to get the audience to believe in the truth of what he was saying,
Yes.
and to be persuaded to a particular course of action.
Right.
According to Litfin, this was not Paul's purpose. He was not trying to get his audience to do something. He wasn't trying to get them to believe in what he was saying. He insisted that creating pistis, faith, was the sole province of the Spirit of God working through the cross of Christ. This Spirit-powered creation of faith in the saving efficacy of the crucified Christ constituted for Paul the persuasive dynamic of the cross. So this
He saw himself as a seed planter.
Correct.
Okay.
And as a proclaimer. He was simply supposed to explain the truth with clarity and simplicity. It was not his job to induce belief in what he was saying.
Right.
Now, if you ask, any Christian preacher today who has what I would take to be a good biblical theology, now I'm, treading on dangerous ground here, and if you ask them, is it your job to induce belief in the truth of what you're saying? I think most of them would say, no, I can't do that.
Right.
They would say that's the gift of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And they would be right. But I think what often happens, both for the preacher and for the listener, is that our experience of what's taking place tends to veer much more toward pagan rhetoric, pagan oratory, which has its place.
Yes.
But this book, its claim is that such does not have a place in Paul's theology of preaching.
Yes.
It's for another context. It's for listening to Bargatze or Gaffigan or Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. That's the right setting. It doesn't belong in this setting.
Gotcha. That's fascinating.
And so this is, to me, a really watershed book.
Yeah.
In part because it helped pull together, maybe this is my weakness, many of the things I already thought, and gave them a good intellectual and theological foundation.
Yeah.
So before I just kind of had intuitions, and some of them proved to be true, but even the true ones received a much better foundation.
Yeah.
And the false ones were weeded out.
Ah, fantastic.
So highly recommend.
Great.
Well, Jeff, I think we need to think about wrapping it up here. How many titles have we covered?
Oh, I think we got through about 9 or 10.
No, I don't think so. I think we got one Gene pick.
Yeah, right.
One, that's Seinfeld reference.
Yeah.
One Jeff pick and 2 Dave picks.
Yes.
Okay.
That's fine. But
are we going to be happy with that?
We're going to be happy with that because all this means that later on down the line we can come back to this subject.
That's right.
We've got books in the chamber ready to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So before we wrap it up, we got some housekeeping items to take care of.
Yes. So if people want to register for the giveaway,
yes.
one last reminder to write to Dave at adnauseam.com. Don't forget that V and type the Latin word quatuor. 4 in your body text.
That's correct. And if you want to get in touch with Jeff, send an email to jeff@adnauseam.com. You want to compliment him, you want to complain about him, you want to ask him to sabotage me, all those things would be fine. You want to be a guest on the show?
Yeah.
We got some really interesting correspondence recently from potential guests and some great things coming down the pike. We have some people to thank, do we not?
We do. As always, Mishka, our wonderful engineer, who turns us around in record time, makes us sound better than we actually are. We got those musicians, Scott Van Zen, Ken Tamplin. Those are the guys whose fingers are on the fretboard and that wonderful music, bumper music you hear throughout the episode. That's those guys who so generously allowed us to use that free of charge.
Absolutely.
Yep.
We're grateful for that.
Yep.
And if you want to learn how to read Greek and Latin,
you've got a way to help them, don't you, Dave?
I do.
Yes.
It's much more fun than it looks. It's actually easier than you have been told. Studying Greek and Latin, they are two of the more predictable and regular and structured languages. They have their charms. English has its charms, but let's be honest, English is kind of chaotic. Who could learn this as a second language?
Crazy.
Not so for Greek and Latin, much more straightforward. Go to mossmethod.com and check out my program, or latinperdiem.com/LLPSI. My YouTube channel has more than 2,100 short, free lessons, and I can send you some accompanying quizzes to get automatic direct feedback on your work to see if you are taking in the Latin and keeping it down. Jeff, what's up for next week?
I don't want
some TBD, right?
TBD. So you sent to me a very interesting article recently that I think that'd be a lot of fun to talk about.
Absolutely.
Latin pedagogy.
We promised perhaps a Christmassy theme.
That's right.
I have some ideas about that. We have to hammer it down and get it ready, but that's a possibility. We usually do something seasonal around this time.
But I think officially we got to say to be determined.
That's correct.
Yep. And Dave, I believe you have this week's gustatory parting shot.
I do. It's from one Paul Prudhomme, Prudhomme.
Oh, he's like a Cajun chef, right?
I don't. That could well be.
Okay,
I'll take it.
Yeah,
I probably mispronounced his name. In fairness, he would probably mispronounce mine.
Right.
He says, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Jeff.
Okay.
You don't need a silver fork to eat good food.
Yeah,
what do you think?
Without a doubt.
Well, how does this relate to the saying that so-and-so was born with a silver spoon in their mouth? Is it related to this at all?
I think he's just saying that, hey, filet mignon tastes just as good with a spork.
I was going to say, a spork?
Yeah, remember those
of
growing
course.
up? Right?
It doesn't know what it wants to be. Is it a spoon or is it a spork?
Right, but Mr. Prudhomme is saying, hey, if that's what you got, that's all you need.
That's how you can take in the classics
and keep them down.
Thanks for listening.